Hi everyone, Sam Eckmann for Gold Derby, joined here today by Adrian Peng Correia, cinematographer for Nobody Wants This, which is a brand new comedy. And I'm just curious, when you're starting out on a brand new show, uh, it's an original idea. So what elements are you kind of latching onto when you're trying to establish the look and feel for a new series?
Well, it's really interesting because the nature of romantic comedies kind of have all the trappings and kind of holds of what the genre is. So you kind of have to entertain the idea of what is traditionally thought of as romantic, what is traditionally thought of as comedic, and that was a funny thing because in the beginning we were trying to find this balance between what would be appropriate and responsible to the idea of what a romantic comedy was, but could we kind of give ourselves some options to be able to make it into something a little bit more textured, a little bit more lively, maybe something that had a little bit more um, panache to it. Maybe not necessarily in terms of the way that the camera is used, but something in the way that maybe where we're a little bit more adventurous with lighting, maybe a little bit more adventurous with contrast and color, and that's basically what we set out to do. And it was Greg Matola in the beginning of our conversations where we started to entertain the idea of using anamorphic to try and just elevate it a little bit in terms of because there wasn't going to be a chance for us to do wild kind of camera moves. It's like the nature of the edit is so important for timing and for creating the sense of balance between characters and the timing in the context of the episode. So anamorphic is one of the easiest things for us to kind of latch on to kind of give a sense of scope to the show and really kind of amp the romantic element of it. And I knew there would be some things just based on the nature of what our production was, where anamorphic would be able to give us just this really kind of great type of stylings and backgrounds, especially around Los Angeles. So we embraced that, and then it really paid dividends, particularly in the first episode with the nighttime dinner sequence with all the kind of highlights and the backgrounds of the Hollywood Hills. So at that point, me and Greg were very very happy. Yeah.
Yeah, that dinner sequence makes me think of you use a lot of close-ups on your actors quite a bit, which is really great because you have really expressive people on this series. What made you kind of gravitate towards that? Because like for that dinner scene, it really comes alive because of them.
Well, we just it's like set precariously on a hillside, and we had so many pages to shoot that day. We had so many things to do. So the mandate, and this is from a production wide, this is not just that particular scene, but from the production as a whole, was like, like we're not using dollies, no lights bigger than what you can plug into a wall, So in terms of like being lean and mean, it was, I mean, that whole dinner scene is lit with one 8 foot tube and one 4 foot uh, LED box. That's the lighting for the entire scene. And then basically it's like positioning them in the right place, maybe having some flame units or some practical lighting bulbs that Claire Bennett, our production designer, gave us, and then basically whatever the existing practicals in the house were on the opposite side from the hill. So, but it's really just two lights, and it's of our it's and it was about being economical. And I come from G&E. I was a terrible camera assistant, so I kind of left immediately to kind of learn lighting. So I know what I can achieve with as little as I need to. And also it allowed us to shoot the Sony Venice, which is a camera, the Venice 2, excuse me, which is a camera that has a really, really clean aesthetic. We could shoot it at really, really high ISOs. The entirety of that show is shot at almost entirely at 4,000 ISO, which is, a couple times higher than even what is the normal rated speed for that camera. And I just think texturally, with some magic that we do in post and the use of the lenses and the quality of our lighting, was going to give us this aesthetic that kind of felt very cinematic and felt filmic. And when you have beautiful people for close-ups, anamorphic really does shine if you could put it into the right backgrounds. And and that's the kind of thing that really kind of sells those moments of connection, at least for Aaron and for Craig DeGreggio, the showrunner. We're making sure that in close-ups they looked amazing. So it's one of those things when you have somebody like Adam and of course Kristen, you need to be able to light them appropriately for close-ups because that's where they were going to really have that connective tissue and that charisma and that magic was in those moments. So
Yeah. And in addition to, the lighting and the very clean feel to it, there's something about the cinematography to me that when I'm watching it as the viewer, it felt like I'm inside the scene as a character almost rather than just observing it. Does that feel accurate to you with your approach? Where does that effect come from?
Well, I think it comes from smart blocking with the actors and directors that know that like what are the strengths of the series. And like the camera's never really far away from any of them. Even on a longer lens and anamorphic in that format at 8.6K, they're still relatively wide lenses. So, the cameras are almost always really close to the action for the most part. Even in a three shot or a wide shot around a table, the lens is still close to the people. So, and that was important in terms of when it was established with Greg, was making sure that the lenses felt like they were with characters. And as a result, it doesn't feel like it has this kind of stateliness that sometimes comes with like the studio feel of a romantic comedy traditionally. It has a bit more of a it's not gritty, but it has a bit more of a kind of this lived in texture of what a handheld camera that's actively close to people would make it feel like it's a more lived in environment. But then you're dealing with an amped up color space, an amped up camera LUT and lighting and use of color, and that gives it the sense of being uh, stylized and cinematic, and the camera helps it feel grounded. So if you use those things together, it kind of creates this universe that makes it feel real, but still elevated like a comedy kind of needs to be.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the approach, what goes into a romantic comedy, but you have a lot of different types of series, very different genres under your belt, everything from Glow to Rami. You have the latest Walking Dead spinoff. Do you feel like even within that breadth of different genres, you have a kind of aesthetic or a style that defines your work, or does it change from project to project?
Well, when I started, I was really conscious of the fact, and this was like maybe this was an old-fashioned fear from cinematographers. So I used to, when I was coming up with, was this idea of being pigeonholed, this idea of being labeled. And that was a great fear because I had no contacts in the industry. So I thought if I could be as labyrinthian way in terms of my artistic expression and not being nailed down to one thing, that would give me the greatest breadth, the greatest chance to tell as many stories as I could, because I didn't really have the resources in terms of people or money or anything. So to be able, the ability to be more of a chameleon in terms of the way I light and the way I choose to frame and the way I use camera, those are the things that are going to allow me to have a scope in a career. And it just ends up having to be that I could do stories like Rami or stories like The Flight Attendant or things like Florida Man and still be able to kind of tell all different kinds of stories and still feel like I'm true to myself as a cinematographer, but I don't get pigeonholed into exactly how he exactly shoots a comedy or how he shoots a drama or even horror films or whatever. So it's important to me just that to be hardwired to the page and to let my motivations come from that. But my taste is the thing that allows me to be able to make the choices. And luckily, I've been able to tell them in all kinds of different kinds of stories, different kinds of people. So
And so when you're diving in between those different genres, is there ever a desire to sort of like go against the grain, make the unexpected choice? When does that come into play?
I mean, that's kind of the thing for a lot of people, right? It's just this idea of like, I'm doing a romantic comedy. I don't want to do a traditional romantic comedy. I mean, that's kind of the thing all cinematographers kind of fight against. This is the idea of trying to be something new. I don't necessarily feel the need that I have to reinvent the wheel. What I feel like I have to do is based on the discussions with everybody above the line and the script writers and the creators and the showrunners is finding a pathway forward based on our prep and our ideas and our tastes and our palettes that we've discovered in the show, and then finding this idea, whatever is the truest point of that expression. Now, sometimes that's kind of like emboldened and kind of embraced by the nature of the genre we're shooting in. Sometimes we find ways to buck back against it. But I think if it's always coming from a point of truth and empathy and character, then it's always going to feel right one way or the other. But there are certain things for me as a cinematographer that I just buck against in terms of trends, whether it means how you light a face or the nature of exposure, how dark is too dark. Like a lot of my references come back from the idea of film noir lighting and black and white lighting, and the idea that if it could look good in black and white, that it should look good in color. And those old aesthetics, like having the brightest point of exposure being the deepest part in the frame for depth. A lot of those things I still try to embrace, and they kind of color who I am and how I shoot.
Well, the truth, empathy, and character is certainly on display in this series. So, Adrian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for the time.
Hi, everyone. Sam Eckmann for Gold Derby here, joined by Kyle Wullschleger, cinematographer for Only Murders in the Building. Uh, and it's really fun with this latest season of Only Murders because the first opening sequence of season 4, we actually get a great moment of cinematography from Once Upon a Time in the West, and the show gets to call it out as something that sticks in viewers' minds. But you get to mimic that famous opening at the end when we reveal Saz down in the basement. Can you break down that sequence for me? How do you kind of update that style of camera work to fit with this show?
Yeah, I think I worked really closely with John Hoffman, is the showrunner and the director of the first and second episode of the season each year, and he kind of came in early, knowing that this was going to be a big part of episode 1, and you know we watched the opening together a few times even, and just kind of spent a lot of time talking about what's going to make sense and what's going to work the best. And it's one of those things. It's little things like just being in the space that we have to work in, and knowing like we have this dog, for instance, that does match this bit, and just finding the tone of what's going on for us while still interlacing that beautiful cinematography by from Once Upon a Time in the West. It's such an opportunity. It was really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and that episode, the first episode, we kind of jump from New York to LA, and there's something about Only Murders where the DNA of the show feels so steeped in New York to me, with the
Totally.
tone and the style. So how do you kind of maintain the tone of that New York setting while jumping to, bright and sunny LA?
Yeah, we actually talked a lot about that too, and in part we wanted the tone to shift, and I think you really do feel that in part. Like the idea of bright and sunny came up a lot, and we worked closely with our colorist afterwards in post, because LA, while we were there, happened not to be so bright and sunny, and so I think in both ways, like we set out to say like, oh, we'll embrace this for what it is, and then it kind of wasn't that. It was another thing, and so it sort of leaned into, you have to. We had 2 days, 3 days to shoot that out there, and so you kind of have to just take what you have and roll with it. I mean, that's the truth of it. But at the end of the day, like the tone, so much comes from those actors, and they're there to deliver uh as they do, but that tonal shift I think was really fun because we had that oneer. I don't know if you remember that we arrive on in New York, in LA,
Yeah.
on a set on the Paramount lot, and to kind of go out and like prep and think about how this oneer is going to look and how to make it feel as much like New York while still giving it, kind of immediately that something's off. And to have that rotate through and then reveal the set and all that kind of stuff, it was such a pleasure to step it up and do that.
Yeah, it's a great reveal. There's also an entire episode which is shot as if it's a documentary filmed by the brother sisters, who have a very, particular kooky style to them. There's handheld cameras, there's spy cams. So how, again, it's a tonal shift. How do you kind of
Very much so.
shift with that? What went into that episode?
So much prep. We what was really fun about that is the brother sisters are close to my age, at least, in the show. And so as we go through their own history, um, the cameras that they used along the way for that was really fun for me because it applied to some of my own experience growing up and getting in touch with technology, and so to be able to kind of apply what I knew already and say like, oh yeah, these are the right choices along the way for their growth and development was really fun. That was a big part of it. And then from there, it's sort of, yeah, like working with Jessica Yu, the director. She came in with a lot of prep as far as placement of those hidden cameras, and then the idea that like Howard is being utilized and sort of, shifting his alliances to whoever, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, knowing that it's all going to the brother sisters. it's exactly what we wanted it to feel like. And the choice to not use our regular cameras at all, because I think that could have been one way to have accomplished it, was sort of the show is happening, but also you're seeing this documentary happen inside of the shows. Really important, I think, to John Hoffman, to Jessica, and especially to myself, that this was really truly a fully found footage um, opportunity. It was really, really fun because at the end of the day, you want it to feel like it just happened, but there was so much work going into making sure that it just felt like it fell off the truck without just falling off of a truck.
Right. And I think part of the real fun of this series is that it invites the audience to try to deduce the killer along with our core trio. But from a cinematography perspective, I've always wondered, how do you kind of properly highlight the mysterious killer character without, giving away, spoiling the whole thing too soon? Oh, they
Right.
lingered on him for a while, so fans catch on. So what is that balancing act like?
Yeah, I think we really rely on John Hoffman, the showrunner, a lot through the whole season, just because in part he is so involved. And so when directors kind of have those questions too of like, well, what's too much, what's too little here, we always rely on John to kind of come in and give us our best motivation for it. But I think it does sort of happen naturally as you go through it in that way where you and I'm sure some of it comes back in the edit too, where we do give those options and those moments and then decide. I think they can decide a little bit later on too, like what's too much, what's too little.
Mm. And I know you inherited this mantle of cinematographer in season 3. What is that like coming on, getting that title in the midst of something that already has a visual identity, right? So
Yeah.
when you come in, what is your process of like, how do I put my stamp here, even though something's already been created?
Yeah, so I come from camera operating. I've been an operator on lots of New York shows, and I came in on season 2 to operate for Only Murders. And so you get, just from being there in the first place, you get a good osmosis of what Chris Teague, who was the original cinematographer for the show, um, what he was after, and kind of what makes sense for the show. And then, for season 3, I think I had a little bit of a like, all right, I'm relatively new to this role. I had done Aquafina's show, Nora from Queens, before that. So I kind of was given this thing that I didn't want to drop, like I was trying to be careful with it. But at the same time, um, season 3 had a different vibe. It was very theatrical. So we talked about that a lot, where like, okay, let's push, especially in the theater, let's push the colors and let's push sort of the scope and the vibe while still making it feel true to what it was in that theater. And then for season 4, I think I took something, and instead of feeling like I was just carrying something carefully, I was ready to like really take the ball and throw it. And I think that shows through a season that's all based around cinema. Each episode had some sort of theme, and so like to do the Sergio Leone thing at the beginning, or an episode like Lifeboat later on, where you get to think about each of these little components and how you can introduce your own style while still then mimicking or taking some inspiration from things that exist already.
Is there maybe something, you didn't get to achieve before as you were figuring out season 3 that you really got to try out and got to, feel like you put your stamp there in season 4?
I think particularly like one thing that sticks out to me is particularly episode 2. Um, it was based on Errol Morris, an Errol Morris documentary. And he does such a it was based on his very first documentary, and he does such bizarre framing and stuff that I've attached to. I've always loved Errol Morris documentaries, and so to take that into the narrative thing that was also balancing this documentary about stunt people that Saz was in, was so much fun for me. And then we kind of applied that as we moved into like meeting all these Westies, these new characters. When you watch it, like we used a lot of wide close up things that the show really hadn't done before. I think we kind of typically covered things in somewhat of a standard way. And instead, we wanted to this space in the West Tower is supposed to feel smaller, but at the same time, I wanted to feel like I'm very close to these people, almost too close to these people who are being oddly inviting at the same time. So there was just a lot of thought process in how we would get to do that. And that was a blast. That was one of my favorite things this season to do.
Well, each episode feels like it had something that was probably very exciting to do. It's great work on Only Murders, so thank you, Kyle, so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Sam Eckmann for Gold Derby, joined by two of TV's top cinematographers here. We have Adrian Peng Correia from Nobody Wants This and Kyle Wullschleger from Only Murders in the Building. To start off, I think I would love to hear just about the cinematographers who inspire you. Like, who gave you kind of the creative inspiration to get behind the camera? Is there someone you look up to?
Oh, go ahead.
It's a good question. I think I I have played so much in the comedy world. I came from as a camera operator, and I love comedy. And I feel horrible in that I don't know a lot of the names of these people that do these comedies. To be honest with you, one of my favorite movies is Hot Rod, and one of the reasons I like it so much is because the cinematographer on that did such a wonderful job of framing and allowing the story to happen in these frames, and letting the camera be both just a beautiful observer, but then when necessary, an active participant. Same with like Shaun of the Dead, and these movies that really utilize the camera almost as a character at times are some of my favorites. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I'm so bad at the names.
Well, I mean, I've done a lot of comedies recently as well, and it's funny, but it's like when I think about cinematographers, like I saw this documentary, Visions of Light, a long time ago, which is one of the things that first told me that cinematographer was actually a job. So like I that's the names come to me because literally they were just being basically just read off to you during this documentary. And I basically used that as a reference point for the beginning of my career. I specifically looked for the names attached to those projects and basically try to learn. I mean, obviously they're all the classic guys like Gordon Willis and Conrad Hall and but a lot of my early references were like classic Hollywood people like Ted McCord and Lee Garms, even John Alton, because his book Painting with Light was a huge deal for me. But I always dug Owen Roizman's work because I spoke earlier about the nature of being a chameleon. And Roizman was always true to himself in terms of the way he photographed anything, whether it was um, French Connection or I think he did The Exorcist. I don't know if I'm going insane, but he also shot stuff like Tootsie, and it's funny that they all have this or Marathon Man. They all have this very specific aesthetic for Roizman's work, but then he always kind of played it very very naturally. So even something like Tootsie, which is like traditionally thinking of like an almost absurdist comedy, has this real kind of similar, not rough hewn, but it has a very realistic style to it. There's not like a huge amount of embellishment, and I always try to bring myself back to that, even when I'm dealing with something that's really stylized in terms of color like nobody. It's so I would probably say at the end of the day, now that I'm 51, that when I think about the North Star, it's usually Owen's work because of the simplicity and the truth. And that's another thing I've gone to is I've tried to become simpler, not just because of the nature of TV production, which obviously Kyle can speak to, as well as the nature of trying to institute your artistry over very truncated schedules and budgets and whatnot. But
Absolutely.
yeah, but simplicity ends up working best, I find. And when I look at somebody like Roizen's work, it's always ends up being something that's inspiring to me about how he did things in such an economical way and still made it feel really elevated and cinematic. So I'd say Roizman at the end of the day.
I like that simplicity. One of the things I really like about both of your series, to me, they both have such a strong sense of place conveyed through the cinematography. I could look at a still from either of your shows and know like this is New York, this is LA. How much does the place, the location of the series inform your whole process? What does that feel like for you?
Yeah, for me, I think so much of what we do is on a stage, like it, but that place, that building feels so like New York, in part because we have awesome production designer. I mean, that's a huge piece of it for me. And then when we do leave the building, which is rare, but when we do leave, um, we're not always able to like go exactly where we want to be in New York. And so you're sort of like depending on a location scout and all that kind of stuff to really make sure that like, all right, this isn't exactly what we want, but let's find this piece of it that does read and feels like it's going to tell that story as best as possible so that you maintain that feel, because it really is in Only Murders, New York is a character in the show, and it informs the attitude and everything else about all these characters. Like it really is the backdrop in more than just being a setting.
Yeah, and Kyle, shooting in New York, like perfect example is like that's why I really like the aesthetic a lot of in terms of the work ethic a lot of New York cinematographers bring is that because of hot zones and the fact that the city's pretty jaded in terms of not caring that you want to shoot your
Certainly.
shows. Yeah, but it breeds in those cinematographers who are shooting New York this not this idea of compromise, but like what do I have? What can I use? And how do I use it in the best way to tell the story? So the improvisational, anticipatory, and this kind of problem-solving nature of cinematography while still being artist in New York shooters,
Yeah.
specifically tied to Kyle's work in the show, that speaks to it. And that's kind of what I brought to Nobody in Los Angeles because it's all practical locations. There's no set work. And that also ties into an aesthetic that was kind of born into me by Local 52 and 600 do this lighting workshop every once in a while. They haven't done it in a while, or at least I haven't seen it in a while. And Lisa Wygand ASC did this whole thing about hard ceilings and why they're so important. It was it was like a mind blowing, mind expanding day about why hard ceilings are so important. And she just illustrated with the use of camera and lighting because it makes you, it doesn't manipulate, but it gives you parameters to try and fit cinematic lighting in a practical location. And ever since that thing, I've always asked for hard ceilings. And if you're shooting in practical locations or you're shooting a place in New York where you can't manipulate certain things, it forces you to be artistic with what you have. And that breeds in you speed and decision making. And that became a big part of what Nobody was. Like, oh, we can't do this. What can we do? We're going to be in this restaurant. We can't look this way. What are we going to do? We're going to be in this house. I can't tent this house, or I can't manipulate or save highlights in the background. What corner can I shoot into? And I'm sure Kyle can illustrate with numerous examples, not just as a cinematographer, but an operator, trying to find the frames in practical locations around New York and in cityscapes where you tell the story as cinematically as possible and not shoot the same things over and over again because everybody's seen New York and Los Angeles in these shows. So, locations play a big part.
I know you both have tackled all the episodes of your season, which is, commonplace these days for TV storytelling. But there are instances where multiple cinematographers kind of take on different episodes. Would you ever want a collaborator? What would you like or dislike about that kind of process of divvying up the work?
I'll say I very much wish I had a collaborator. It's Only Murders is awesome in that we're able to accomplish what we're able to accomplish, and some of that's because we're so much on a stage. Um, but to miss out on prepping with the directors throughout the season, my prep is limited to lunches and a weekend here and there, is sort of the worst. And so I think if given the opportunity, um, and I am so much more of a collaborative filmmaker in the first place. I want to walk into a space, and if nobody has an idea, I've got 10 for sure. But I want to walk into a space with my gaffer and my key grip and hear what their thoughts are too, and like knowing that whatever we combine is going to be come up with as a combination is almost always going to be better than my singular idea. Um, but yeah, to have a additional cinematographer just from the standpoint of getting more time with the directors would be phenomenal. I think the truth is, like, in some ways I feel that way as you get through the middle episodes of Only Murders, where we do something a little bit more reactionary, which is a skill set in its own. And I would hope that for people watching it, you don't feel that as much. But you know, with the first and second episodes, that's where my prep gets to go to. I get brought in a couple weeks before we start shooting, and we really shot list and get to very much do the proper prep on those first couple episodes. But from there, it becomes a little bit more reactionary filmmaking, and I prefer to be a prepared filmmaker.
Yeah, my next show is I will have an alternate. I've had the opportunity in a couple shows to have alternates, and it does allow you the breadth. It allows you to also, if you haven't worked with a director, it allows you to form some type of shorthand and some type of relationship where you understand their taste, as opposed to them showing up on set or just having a lunch with them, or maybe even a coffee or a drink after a night of shooting, where you're always kind of drained anyway. Is just trying to find like some type of vernacular that when you get on set, they know that you've got them, and they understand the way you're trying to work and your methodology of the show, because they're trying to adapt to that too, especially if they're a guest director and it's the first time. So having an alternate allows you that breadth to be able to kind of form relationships, understand. And certain directors, like, they might want to shoot close-ups at a different way. They might have their own methodology and idea about what focal length communicates the best thing for them. And you might be like, well, our actor really looks best on a 40, and they're like, oh, well, I really like a 28, 2 feet from them. So it gives you the time to be able to kind of like jigsaw together your ideas and jigsaw together your sense of taste, and make that fit in the show, so you don't have this kind of drastic separation between artistic intent of one person and the show at the same time. So, and if you have, and also if you get to choose the alternate, or you get to work with someone you're really close to, oftentimes if you have a friend you haven't seen in a long time and you get to shoot a show with them, it's a really great thing. That when I got to shoot Walking Dead in Florida Man with my friend Wes Cardino, who was my operator on Nobody. And it's just a really great thing. And that's a fertile ground for anybody out there as a student, is especially in television, is like, operators, when they bump up, almost always have wonderful success as DPs, because they know exactly how to collaborate. They know exactly how to like tune the set in a real way. So your operators are invaluable resources in that way. So yeah. Sorry,
You know,
to
you
divert it a
mentioned,
little bit there.
not at all, because you mentioned something that sparked a question here, is that the multiple directors that often come on in a series, I would imagine that would be so difficult to, there's of course a showrunner who's overseeing, but a new director comes in, has their own rhythm, their own wants and desires, way of working. What are your ways of kind of diving in and fitting into that rhythm on such a short notice?
Yeah, Adrian, how many directors did you have on Nobody Wants This?
We had two episodes per director per block, so we had five.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's the
yeah.
same for me on Only Murders this season, at least. Yeah, it's difficult, especially when you don't have the alternating DP. At the same time, Only Murders has a few directors that are returning, which is, it's kind of great that you can know that, okay, we're getting back to somebody who knows the show and knows the rhythm of things. But one of our new directors this season was Jessica Yu, who did episodes 5 and 6, was that found footage episode. And she's such a collaborator that, like, almost within the first hour of talking to her, because our bit of prep that we did have was a phone call, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe a lunch, like we were talking about. But pretty quickly you're like, oh, this person's coming in incredibly prepared, and there's nothing to be concerned about, and it's a very supportive environment that way. And then, like, if you do need to make a late night phone call, or they're making a late night phone call to you, it's something then that you're going to be able to handle. It's not that big of a deal. The flip side of that is, yeah, when you have somebody who you don't know at all, and maybe they're insecure, nervous, whatever, I think it's the opportunity to step up and stand strong, and know that there are some things you can fall back onto for the show. And I think sometimes you have to, like, an example that comes to mind from season 3 is we had a director who said, like, well, let's just shoot this scene handheld. And Only Murders really, like, we established, kind of from Chris Teague, the original cinematographer, that there's almost no handheld in the show unless it's for a flashback scene. And the only time we did some handheld this season was for the Meryl Melissa McCarthy fight scene. So like only if it's really, really driven. And the reason that this director wanted to do handheld was just to save some time. And so I kind of got to lean on the show and say, like, we just don't do that and maintain a a cinematographic choice that just made sense for the show still to keep that style and sort of lean into those things that like are established by the way we do things.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You could use the show as the backbone, as basically the bedrock and the Bible that kind of dictates a lot of those things. And it depends on your director too. Like some directors are really into camera, really know how and want to use it. And some directors are just concerned about the human condition and may end up
Yes.
wanting you to do the heavy lifting in terms of the way cameras implemented, and again, like because you don't have the prep time, especially on like half hours, which you're shooting every episode, like you kind of really have to be ready on your feet as a cinematographer to be able to attack those things. That's why the prep is so precious. But also having a firm idea of what drives you as a cinematographer in the storytelling of those series. Those are the things you can fall back on is that bedrock of how you've instituted the language visually, and then what actually can work for you. So it really does depend because there are some directors who have like, if you have the language of the show, like in Murders, like then you can really kind of like anchor yourself to that in a way that like feels true to the show and still allows you to be artistic. And then if you have a show that's a little bit more free flowing, like Nobody, you can kind of just be hot wired to the emotional quotient of the scene, and you can implement camera that way as long as it feels right. And sometimes it really, really works, and sometimes it might not feel particularly right. But it's like those are the kind of things as a cinematographer you kind of have to know immediately, whether it's in the context of rehearsals or just in the way that your director is coming at it. Now, if you have somebody like Jessica Yu, who's maybe the smartest person I've ever met, because I did Quiz Lady with her. I mean, the most
Oh yeah.
prepared, brilliant woman, brilliant person, almost frighteningly so in terms of how incredibly intelligent she is, and then calm at the same time. Yeah, I mean, then you're lucky because it's Jessica's awesome. But yeah, it's just funny. It's a lot of personalities, and you have to be malleable, and that's why a lot of people like cinematographers who are kind of even keel and are able to kind of keep that calm blue ocean aspect of production because it can't be a little bit crazy in terms of meshing all these egos and storytelling kind of
Absolutely.
perspectives.
That's such a good point too, is kind of to remain unflappable in the presence of different personalities and egos and everything else, like to have that sense of calm and knowing that people can turn to you, that you're not just going to feel like you're in a blank space yourself all of a sudden, that people can turn to you because you know that you are the backbone of the show because you are there the whole time.
A lot of spoons, a lot of spoons in the pot. Yeah.
And some of these things like the multiple directors, the issues of prep time, they are kind of specific to television work. What is it about TV, this long form storytelling that appeals to you, that speaks to you, maybe versus a filmmaking on a movie?
I think for me, I've in part, I caught the TV wave as an operator, and it really became my wheelhouse. I've only operated on a couple films even, and so I really do know the TV world so well. And I think that yeah, there's a pace to it that is exciting and fun, and when it all comes together, it's so gratifying, and still to be able to leave your identifying mark on it, or have, even if it's not something that people at large are recognizing, it's a little bit of that artistic uh satisfaction for yourself, knowing that like, oh yeah, I can walk into a room and I can figure this out real quickly with the help of a team, and we will make something really wonderful, is satisfying. Now that said, I would love to do a film and to prep things thoroughly throughout the whole thing, and have the time to really figure out how to tell the story as best as possible before you ever bring a camera on the set. Like that would be wonderful to do. But I'm sort of, I've marinated in the TV world, and I'm sure I will keep working in it as much as possible.
I think, you know, it's like I came from the opposite side of it, which was like I had made like I think it was 26 or 27 films, all under million, like all very, very small, which is actually the most fertile and perfect ground to actually prepare you to shoot TV because you don't have the money, you don't have the time, you don't have any of the resources. You usually have crews who a mix of people who are experienced and a mix of people who are like don't really have the experience but are super eager. And in television, you kind of have to move so quickly, and that's really about those anticipatory skills and the problem solving stuff that we spoke about a little bit earlier. You know, like I developed that shooting a lot of those small movies. Whereas like Kyle probably developed a lot of that stuff on shorts and then operating on shows as well in terms of being able to see problems ahead of time, be able to cut things off at the pass. And it's that helped me. And then at a certain point, I made a conscious effort to move to TV because I just saw the fact that like there were so many interesting stories, there were so many interesting opportunities. And around 2015, I remember talking to my agent being like, I think we should move to TV. And then I just happened to get a couple of opportunities, whether it was Glow or American Princess with Genji Cohen and Jamie Denbo or Rami. And then it just kind of sat in these universes where I was reading these golden era TV scripts and being like, wow, this is really incredible. This is really incredible. And then just getting that bigger kind of toe into television production. And at a certain point, it becomes self-sustaining, especially if you have a good relationship or you have a good reputation. And they're like, this is a person who shoots really well because because you're there all the time, every episode, like Kyle was saying, like they know that you can steer the ship. They know you can keep everything above water and get it to the finish line. And that becomes a huge deal from predatorially speaking. So that's when, you know, television just ends up having these kind of long form, these bigger breaths, these longer, interesting arcs for side characters that sometimes might not get the time in a feature film. In television, they end up getting usually their own episode or like a moment, you know, and you can see it with shows like The Bear, when like all these characters get like interesting little side arcs, like in episodes like Honeydew and whatnot, where you can follow a character down a slight rabbit hole and it still feels within the context of the universe. And that's a really interesting, freeing thing to be able to tackle in TV. It allows you not just shoot a show, but to shoot all these different kind of avenues of all these different kinds of stories and people. So there's incredible breadth in that. So it's a really interesting and fertile ground for storytellers.
And TV has become more filmic. I think the expectation is to make it. We on Only Murders we do not light overall. You know, we are lighting per setup and like still trying to make it look as cinematic as possible.
That's got great mood.
Yeah, like I really try and take that and make sure that stays as a consistent part of what I'm doing, so that we don't just get too flat and make it look general, just so we can move fast. But we still move fast while making it look as cinematic as possible.
And making those stars look great because they look awesome. So well
thank you. Yeah.
But it's
yeah,
like, yeah, but you have to deliver that too. It's like you
Yeah,
got to be mood. You keep the mood, keep it cinematic, keep it comedic, but they got to look great. And it's funny.
and make Meryl Streep look great. Exactly.
Yeah, but it's kind of like the old Hollywood studio system in that way. And there's a reference actually back to Visions of Light where they talk about the stars and they're like, have all the shadows you want, have everything happening around them, but keep the shadows off their faces, or basically keep those stars looking beautiful. And that's the great thing about being a television cinematographer in a lot of ways, is that you can have all these different choices and you have all these different safeguards and parameters in terms of how you have to structure things as well. It is an interesting thing to navigate artistically all the time. And Kyle does a great job on that show. So
thank you.
Yeah, you're
welcome. Well, they both look great, both of these series. So thank you both, Adrian and Kyle, for this great conversation. And everyone watching, make sure you check out Only Murders in the Building and Nobody Wants This. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching, guys.